Welcome everybody to Conversations in Lung Cancer Research, a TOGA podcast where we discuss the latest breakthroughs in lung cancer research and treatment for Australia and New Zealand. My name is Mel Moore, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live and work. We pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and we also extend that respect to all Indigenous people. It's my pleasure today to interview and speak to someone who will be very well known to all our members, the TOGA Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Megan Sanders. As you would know, Megan is a strategic leader with more than 2 decades of experience spanning cancer research, clinical trials and organisational leadership. She's the current CEO of TOGA, where she drives the organisation's vision, strategy, oversees operations and builds sustainable partnerships through industry sponsorship, grants and philanthropy. I'd like to welcome Megan to TOGA's Conversation in Lung Cancer Research podcast.
Thank you, Mel. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Megan, I often start by asking people on these podcasts how they've got to where they are. I know that you've got a science background. I too have an undergraduate science degree, and I can probably safely say that I never woke up during my science degree thinking that one day I might be a CEO of a cancer cooperative trials group. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you went from white coat and safety goggles to where you are today?
Sure. I definitely didn't wake up one morning and go, that's where I'm going to be either. So I did a Bachelor of Science and Honours, and then I wanted a job. So I started working at CSL Limited, and I was in a department called Formulation and Downstream Processing. And we were scaling up vaccine manufacture from small little bottles. And the end of our department, they were in small tanks, and then they went off to manufacturing. So that was quite an interesting area. It was a great first job. It's the only time I've worked in private industry. And I actually had some fantastic bosses and mentors one in particular who encouraged me to do a PhD when I foolishly said in a performance appraisal, I think maybe one day I should do a PhD. I'm not sure I'm quite finished with study. So he encouraged me to do it, and then I returned into academia to complete a PhD at Melbourne Uni. Immunology had attracted me despite not doing immunology in my undergrad. So never being one to shy away from a challenge, I decided to roll undergrad immunology into a PhD in immunology, which was challenging, but got there in the end. So the PhD was on vaccines stimulating CD8 T cell responses. And then after I finished that, I actually enjoyed my final year of my PhD more than I expected to do. So I did search for a postdoc, and I did a postdoc at the Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research, so real bench science there. That was actually where I first met Tom John, who is a well-known TOGA member, and Joe Way, another TOGA member. But I found once I started a family that bench science was quite difficult in terms of compatibility, long hours, not so great with picking children up from childcare, throwing out assays because you suddenly have to pick up a sick child. So I returned to clinical trials, and at that point became aware of the cooperative clinical trials groups, and I started a position with the Australasian Leukemia and Lymphoma Group as their protocol development coordinator. And I think I held that position for about 3 or 4 years, had another child in there somewhere. And then they made a decision to set up an in-house trial centre. They have probably a larger clinical trial portfolio than TOGA does, so they can sustain that type of business. And I was charged with scoping that, setting it up, and then leading it. And that piece of infrastructure still exists today. And then when I no longer wanted to do that, I spent a year working for for ACTA, the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, which was fascinating because I came into contact with all the other cooperative trials groups. So what I had learnt from my experience at the ALLG, I realised it was quite similar to the other trials groups, particularly the other cancer trials groups. The non-cancer trials groups are perhaps a little bit different. I think that they have some strengths against the cancer groups, and the cancer groups will have some strengths compared to them. And then after that, I came to ALLTG/TOGA.
Fantastic. And here you are. Quite ironic, Megan, that you've done an immunology PhD, given the current climate in cancer and particularly lung cancer treatment. So I'm sure that has served you well. You mentioned that you'd returned to clinical trials when you went to ALLG. So your first job with CSL, that was a clinical trials focused job?
Yes, I should have mentioned that actually, because not only did they do formulations, but they did the stability of the vaccines and they did the clinical trial supplies. So I sat there and I labelled little clinical trial vaccine jars as one of my first jobs, and also clinical trial returns. But you learn about the whole area, I suppose. And when I was at CSL, I was also trained in GMP. So having been trained in good manufacturing process, good clinical process is quite relaxed compared to that. So it wasn't a big leap for me to move into clinical trials. And I suppose Ludwig also, although I wasn't in one of the groups that did the clinical trials, they had groups that moved from sort of research into phase 1 clinical trials. At the time I was working at Ludwig, that was a bit of a gap in the sector. There'd be a lot of academic research discoveries that just couldn't get into phase 1 trials, whereas I think now the gap is more sort of, you'll see the biotechs run the phase 1, but they can't move into the phase 2 without a collaboration with a larger company. So it's a little bit different now. But I suppose I was constantly exposed to clinical trials, so it didn't feel like I was coming in cold. For people that try and make that leap from academia to clinical research, that's quite hard to do. Having said that, I've never had direct contact with an ethics committee, done an ethics submission. If you asked me to actually do the management of a clinical trial, I've never actually been a clinical trial coordinator. I jumped straight to management of a team in that space. So yeah, I might struggle
I'm sure
a little
you've
bit.
gleaned some knowledge along the way, though, about those processes. So I guess benchside science and clinical trials are necessary for each other, but very different skill sets and experiences. How have those different experiences shaped the way you approach your current role?
I guess they complement each other. I think it probably helps that I was on if you look at the sort of pipeline of research, I was on the end of the pipeline that was quite close to clinical research. So I always had some sort of idea of that was where everything was headed. I think while I do say they complement each other, I think for a long time I couldn't see the way they complemented each other. It's only as I've risen to the more sort of strategic roles that I can draw on those different sources of knowledge. When I was managing the trial centre, I don't think I used my immunology much. I used the skills from the PhD because I would always say, well, a clinical trial protocol is simply a very large experiment on paper. And when you're designing it, you want to make sure that you haven't missed anything. But I think I've used the research more at TOGA, the immunology, than I did in haematology. And it's probably a little bit to do with where lung cancer research is at the moment. And you touched on it before, that immunology, we're right in the midst of it with lung cancer. And we really are. The areas that I specialised in my postdoc, which is antigen presentations of CD8 T cells, is very relevant for checkpoint inhibitors. And also as we start seeing newer immunotherapies, vaccines coming in. So I think they are a complement. Having had the research background, I can speak the language. That helps with clinicians too, but certainly the trials experience did that as well.
So TOGA's been an entity for just over 5 years now. And as you alluded to, the precursor organisation was ALTG, which was under the auspices of Lung Foundation Australia. And I guess for those people that may not be aware, TOGA actually started in the midst of the COVID pandemic. So it was a bit of a unique start for us as an organisation. I say us because I'm a member of the board, so I was involved at that point of very exciting times. what would you say are the biggest achievements of TOGA in its first 5 years of existence?
Yeah, I think the fact that we've really risen to become the premier lung cancer research organisation in 5 years. I think we went through the startup phase quite quickly. Startup is characterised just by let's get everything done. You're very reactive. The benefit is that you can take on new opportunities because you're quite agile at that time. But it is a relief to start looking a bit more prospectively, I suppose. In terms of the achievements, I think full credit to you, Mel. The education program has been a real standout in that time. And you think back to our first virtual ASM, which I think was in 2021, and had to pivot in 2 weeks to a virtual format. And I think the numbers were probably 280. And for the last 2 years, we've seen over 400 at our face-to-face meetings. So we really have risen as the premier organisation that the healthcare professionals look to for that medical education, which is incredibly needed in the lung cancer sector with the pace of the research and the new medicines and treatments coming through. So that would probably be the thing I'd latch on to the most. But along the way, I think we've had other wins. The membership engagement has been strong from day one and continues to rise.
Just on the membership engagement, sorry to interrupt, I feel like TOGA's been very good at trying to be multidisciplinary. And although medical oncologists are probably our biggest percentage membership, I think we're increasingly reaching a broader multidisciplinary group, both in terms of membership, education event attendance, and attending the ASM as well.
Yes, I think so too. And I think that was deliberate when we set up TOGA to expand. We realised that the strength in lung cancer treatment is multidisciplinary engagement. This is why we have multidisciplinary team as the gold standard in lung cancer. And it's definitely risen. I did have a quick snapshot at the membership figures before I got onto this call. They're at just over 600 at the moment, which is quite incredible, but we are in a peak. And the highest group is medical oncology. The next highest group is the consumer and patient advocates. And the third group is now respiratory medicine, which I don't think it was. And I think that reflects the advent of screening and a higher interest in lung cancer from that sector. So I think while we've done a lot to attract multidisciplinary engagement, the sector itself has become stronger in multidisciplinary engagement. They've needed more multidisciplinary input, and I think it's benefited the treatment, the pathway for the patients overall to have better cohesion. So I think it was a good move, and it was done in an opportune time.
And do you think that opens up more opportunities for clinical research and clinical trials? So that's a bit of a Dorothy Dixer. I'm assuming the answer is going to be yes, but could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it definitely will open up and does open up opportunities for clinical research. The different disciplines are trained differently in clinical trials when they come up through their medical training, and that's quite clear. It's very deeply embedded into medical oncology and also radiation oncology, but not so much into surgery and respiratory medicine. So the approach needs to be different, and it may well be different areas too. I think we don't do a lot of implementation science in this country, but there's no reason why you can't run clinical trials in the implementation science area. TOGA is looking to expand to include a working group on quality care in lung cancer treatment. The name is still a little bit undecided, but it will look more at quality of standard of care and whether there's outliers, because we've seen that a large portion of the membership is interested in that. And in that area, you could well trial an intervention that improved quality care as opposed to the trials that we've traditionally looked to, which are trials that improve treatment.
I think that's a really exciting new direction for TOGA because, we all know there's different access to lung cancer treatments, different access to clinical trials, different access to MDM discussions. So I think being able to quantify and do research in that area, is just as important as trialing new drugs, new therapies as well. So that's really great to hear, Megan. I'm going to change tack a little bit. Prior to your ALTG and TOGA experience, had you had direct contact with a board of directors before, or is that a new phenomenon for you?
It's new as a board as the whole. I've had
Yeah.
contact with individual directors before, but I've never reported to a board as a whole. And you're correct in your assumption, Mel. It is different because you've grown up in a line management scenario where you've got a line manager of one. And although technically I have a line manager of one, I still have 8 people and 8 opinions when actually, I think it's 9. There's only 7 at the moment. When you present a new idea and you've got to assimilate them, that's quite different to presenting a new idea to just a single line manager. So it wasn't something I had prepared for, let's put it that way. It was a bit of a different thing and a bit unexpected. I had to do a bit of a rapid think about how to handle it.
Yeah. And look, I also, recall that, that initial board, there was quite a few of us that had not had really any board experience or very minimal board experience. I think Michael Boy was probably safe to say was the most experienced. So that must have had its challenges as well, dealing with a bunch of newbies, but experienced clinicians and researchers. But none of us really had a lot of idea about board function.
I suspect we grew together, but yes, full credit to Michael Boyer. Was very stabilising influence on the board, just knew what was what without being overly restrictive and still allowed initiatives to go forward and not wasn't risk adverse, wasn't over the top with any sort of governance structure, fully favoured the flexible, just enough approach.
Yeah, no, it was very, very useful. So I think we've come a long way.
We have.
What do you think are some unique challenges of research, clinical trials research in the thoracic oncology area?
Yeah, well, one of the things is it wasn't an attractive career move 20 years ago. Sorry, Mel, but Laird has just been on a podcast saying this. Everyone thought he was mad.
To do lung cancer, do you mean?
Yes. And we
Wow.
can see it sort of in terms of the trainees that come forward now, is now they're really interested because lung cancer has got a lot of scope and a lot of area to make your mark. And it's fascinating. Genomics, immunotherapy, there's really areas that can really change the outcomes. But I think it wasn't attractive. So what we're seeing now at the top end of the more senior people is that we haven't got enough numbers in terms of trialists. We've only got a few trialists. We've also lost a few along the way who've gone into other careers who were contributing to the trial space. So I guess that's a challenge. And it's a challenge for me to see at the moment the next wave of trialists. It could be because I'm more conscious of this than I ever was at the Australasian Leukemia and Lymphoma Group, where they had a different structure. It's not an appropriate structure for TOGA, but that mentoring was done with the disease group chairs and it wasn't that visible to the ops staff. So the operations staff just saw this continual influx of new trialists presenting a concept and there were just more people. So that's probably one of the unique aspects of thoracic oncology for research. The other one is that in about 2012, Cancer Australia did an audit and discovered that the funding to lung cancer was particularly low in comparison to the public health burden and concluded that this may well be due to smoking-related stigma, and since then have made efforts to increase the funding to lung cancer. However, if you actually really dig into the report, which they're about to do it again, I think. They run it every 4 or 5 years. You can see that the cancers that are better funded above us have got a significant source of philanthropic funding, so breast cancer, prostate cancer, whereas lung cancer doesn't have a lot of philanthropic funding. So that also contributes to the lack of funding in the research space.
And do you think that's linked to the smoking stigma as well, the association of lung cancer with smoking?
Possibly. I think it just wasn't an attractive area. And there's probably a few reasons for that. Like for a long time, not much could be done either. It was chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgery if you got caught early. But we know that not many people were diagnosed early until we've brought in things like the screening program and early detection. So I think you would have had to have had a particular strength in your personality or desire in your personality to work in that field compared to perhaps some of the other tumour fields which had a better survival rate, or at that point had more, they were actually moving forward in their survival rate, whereas lung was pretty stagnant for quite a while. If you look at the stats, it did move forward, but in terms of exciting new treatments that might have helped, they only sort of came online about a decade ago.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully the lung cancer screening program just raises the profile of lung cancer in general in the community and, perhaps helps break down some of those barriers to funding and philanthropy. You mentioned the next wave of trialists coming through. What do you perceive as the main, I guess, challenges or barriers to people, I guess, making their mark in lung cancer research?
I think it's harder to run investigator-initiated trials now. I may not have everyone always thinks their own area is the hardest, so I may not get support on that point, but certainly if you look 10 years ago, the regulations around investigator-initiated trials were not as strict. The other thing is that cancer has diversified into subtypes, which means that pharma have marketing and trial interests in smaller areas. They've had to, like they no longer have the big markets of just a tumour type of cancer. Everything is always diversified and it's going to diversify further. So they're interested in the smaller markets that previously might have been the domain of the investigator-initiated trialist. So there's competition in there. I think also lifestyle. Lifestyle is harder. There's more dual working parents. There's more, I think clinicians are expected to do more with less. We think about the size of the molecular testing reports that come through and, not all those results are actionable, but you've still got to sift through them all. We've just launched a lung cancer screening program. There was not really any extra workforce. So that's going to really bite because all our research is done it's all voluntary, the design of the research. So it's all done on clinicians' own time, pretty much. Even if they hold a research position, it's unusual for that research position to cater for designing investigator-initiated trials. I think that's predominantly done on their own time. So just the demands on life are going to shrink that ability for people to design investigator-initiated trials. So we're looking at ways where we can support people better with that. And of course, funding's always an issue.
Do you feel like the amount of sort of publicly available funding is harder to get? That's the anecdotal feeling.
It's definitely got harder in medical research overall. I think the MRFF program alleviated that for clinical research slightly, has a slightly better success rate than NH and MRC, I think. But NH and MRC, as it used to be, wasn't really designed for clinical trials. It wasn't enough. The 3 or 5 year timeframes on them are often not long enough for trials. So I think the MRFF program really has boosted clinical research. It's designed for it.
And I guess just on that point about lifestyle, I think the number of full-time jobs in a single institution out there, it feels to me that is almost a thing of the past. You've got people that are working across multiple sites, fractional appointments, and we all know that multiple part-time positions is always going to add up to more than a single EFT. There's demands at every location that you're at. So I think that's a challenge for people coming through as well in terms of having time or their own time to develop clinical trial protocols. You alluded to TOGA potentially helping out in that regard. What can TOGA, or what is TOGA doing to help bring that next generation through?
We've always had the ability to support people in clinical trial design. That's part of the infrastructure funding that we get from Cancer Australia from the Support for Cancer Clinical Trials grant. But we are looking at expanding that in-house in the future so we can provide that support and perhaps focus it a little bit more towards the academic grants, the MRFFs, the NH and MRC grants, even some of the researcher grants, if someone wants to go down that path of sort of combining a clinical career with bench research, which a few people do want to do. So we're hoping to expand it a little bit, resource willing, of course, which could be an issue. So we'll have to look at that quite closely. But we have recognised that people just don't have time to do the writing for grants, and with the success rate quite low, there's often not a lot of incentive to write away into the middle of the night, particularly like a scientist has to do it. That's where their salary comes from. But a clinician has a busy clinical workload. Their first priority is their patients.
And I think as well, not everybody is a good scientific writer. Not everyone has that skill. And I think it's quite clear when you're reading grant applications of the people that do and the people that don't. So I think being able to provide some guidance and support in that, is a great initiative. So Megan, TOGA's recently released its 2025 to 2028 strategic plan. How do you see this as a roadmap for TOGA's next 5 years?
So as I mentioned, I think we're moving into being proactive rather than reactive. So I guess looking at our strengths and what works, what we need to invest in more because it's a priority. So the strategic plan, I suppose, sets out the priorities, which I should probably go through them for clarity. The number one is broaden and deepen research excellence. Number two is strengthen and mobilise our membership. Number three is influencing future care, which is really the education program and the translation of research. Fourth is raise TOGA's profile and influence. And fifth is scale and sustain for long-term impact. So they're not overly different to other similar organisations. When I look at other clinical trial groups, we tend to have roughly the same strategic plan. We might word it differently. Membership engagement is huge because we are an organisation that works with volunteers. So all those aspects of how to engage with volunteers that you might see in a charity that, raises funds in another way, also apply here because you are trying to motivate people for the mission, the vision, a cause. So that's always going to be critical to ensure engagement. I would like to take a better focus on the research aspect because I think the time is right. We've got these amazing advances coming with the new immunotherapies, bispecifics, ADCs. Hopefully we'll be able to maximise some of those drugs and run our own investigator-initiated trials with those treatments. And also, as I mentioned previously, just supporting that next generation of trialists. I think the education program continues to go from strength to strength, even without sort of introducing new initiatives there. I think we often see, there's a gap here, and then we produce something that might fill that. So last year we started running the masterclasses, one-day events of just going over standard of care in new areas on a particular disease type. This year, 2026, it'll be on small cell, which is the next area that's starting to change. And we're also running something on how to read genomics reports. So I think with the education program, we identify the gaps and we run another event. So it tends to have a shorter sort of time span to implementing. So it's not static, but I guess it doesn't necessarily have the long-term vision that maybe some of the others have that might be a bit more akin to something related to the strategic plan. Raising our profile and influence is just an ongoing thing, but we've in the last year put a really concentrated effort into increasing our digital footprint. I think it's working. We've had a massive increase in podcast listens this year. We have released double the number of episodes, but even if you account for that, the listenership is definitely up. So I think TOGA is establishing more of a national and potentially global footprint, raising our awareness. So that's good for TOGA itself and also feeds into sustainability.
So, Megan, you've been over the strategic plan and you've already alluded to some of the challenges, but what do you see are the specific challenges over the next 5 years for TOGA and for the sector as a whole?
So starting with TOGA, I think a key question will be, do we stick to what we're doing well or do we expand? So we will expand within the areas that we're doing well, but do you take on new areas as well? I think that's probably a challenge for the board rather than me, but probably a discussion that we will need to have together. There are some areas that perhaps we have not been as strong in to date. We haven't done a lot of advocacy as TOGA. We do small amounts, but we haven't had a really high profile in changing policy or anything like that. So there's a question whether we enter into that. I think equitable care, which you touched on earlier, is going to become more and more of an issue. We'll see the gap, I think, with First Nations Australians is already very wide. While we're trying to address it, there is potential that it will widen further. I think the socioeconomic gap that we'll see will widen further. Also, all those priority populations, regional, are we going to see gaps? And I think that's where the care group, the quality care group that we're introducing will be really important, because I think we're going to see more of the gaps, or we recognise it more, and we recognise that we can no longer have cancer care as a postcode lottery. It's got to be more evenly distributed. I think continued efforts in the sector, siloed efforts, and a lack of national infrastructure. So I think one thing that is really missing in lung cancer is a national clinical quality registry. With the outcomes and the survival as poor as it is, it seems an obvious one to run a registry in, a funded registry from government, but we don't have it.
Does any cancer type have that?
Probably not cancer funded from government, I think. There are cancer registries, but I don't think they're funded from government. I guess there are funded registries in the non-cancer sector, but they normally come when there's something that needs to be looked at. So the medical device registry, that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head, but I think there's some others that were prompted to have national funding because there was something that needed to be looked at. And then most of the other ones are just born out of effort, and continued funding is always an issue for registries. Even if you get the initial grant, how are you going to keep funding it? So it is a real lack, and I guess it's an obvious area that if it needs continued funding, commitment from government would help with that. And it can have an amazing change in terms of quality care. We've seen data presented by Fraser Brims and Rob Sterling over the years that shows us how much presenting the outliers in care to the particular outlying site can prompt changes in care so they become more like the norm. And the Victorian Lung Cancer Registry's definitely shown that one, because it's been in existence since 2012, and their reports show that their outliers have become fewer across that time.
Yeah, so a national body of data, whilst probably taking a bit of funding to do, would probably reap benefits in terms of outcomes and overall health economics, you would think, and data's so powerful.
Yes, and it's not even really strict the type of research we'd normally think about. It's got more to do with delivering quality of care and translation, I suppose, because every time we do get a new research outcome, there's the risk that you will again see that difference as unless it's translated well, you will see that difference in care, because some clinicians will be more aware of the advances than others. And while that is generally circumvented in Australia through the PBS, in that once a medicine goes on the PBS, it becomes standard of care and it's pretty universally adopted. We are seeing new classes of medicines. And again, that's where the TOGA educational program is quite useful, because we provide that education for the new classes of medicines, and that lessens, if there had been any sort of reluctance to take it on, that lessens that, I believe, by just tapping into that collegiate network. And people can also ring a friend to find out, oh, I've had this problem with the medicine. That's another bonus of TOGA. I haven't mentioned that one, but it is a real bonus of TOGA, and the clinicians certainly talk about that. It's not something we monitor centrally, but we know it's a benefit.
Oh, absolutely. Because I think it's easy when you're sitting in a tertiary referral hospital with an MDT and colleagues to bounce things off. That's a very different situation to someone who's in either a single private practice or operating across all cancer types in the regions, for example, trying to keep on top of everything. We think of how rapidly lung cancer is changing. There's lots of cancer fields that are changing rapidly as well. So that information exchange is absolutely critical. And I think can't underestimate that phone a friend aspect.
Absolutely. And, the registries will put data on that, because those two groups that you mentioned are the ones we often talk about. But then we know sometimes when we run other forums that we have major public hospitals that are really struggling with whether it's throughput or infrastructure resource too. So that's I think there's that quote that unless you collect it, you can't do anything about it. So you don't even see it. So unless we're collecting it in a clinical quality registry, you won't see it. And it has the potential to really change care. Advances in treatments do as well, but you have to do the other half of it too to check that it's properly implemented.
Absolutely. Can't forget that half of it. So Megan, that brings our discussion to a close. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I know we have conversations regularly, but it's nice to have a chat in this sort of forum. It's been an absolute delight working with you in TOGA, and looking forward to more years of working together and doing some good things for people in the lung cancer community. It's an amazing organisation. I'm probably biased, but the lung cancer community is very collegial. The ASMs are always a fun place to be. Our educational events are always collegial, and everyone's happy to help out. And I think it's really great that TOGA has a role in fostering that as well. So thank you for all that you're doing and have done for TOGA. And it's been lovely talking.
Thank you on all counts also, Mel, because you've done a lot for TOGA as well.
Thank you, Megan. So that brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks again to Megan for joining us today. As always, thanks for listening to TOGA's Conversations in Lung Cancer Research. If you enjoy our show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and look forward to joining you again next time. Thank you.